Okay, we are recording and live streaming. Mr. Vice Chair, I'll hand the meeting over to you.
Thank you. We'll call the meeting to order. And the first item is, are there any declarations of interest? Hearing none, we'll move right on to the presentation. So I'll turn it over to Randy to introduce our presenter.
Yeah, good morning, Development Charges Steering Committee. So today, of course, we have with us Stefan, as well as Rachel has joined us from Hemson. They'll be walking through some proposed adjustments to the DC capital program, presenting our draft development charge rates, doing a bit of a rate comparison in terms of how those draft DC rates compare with others, and then starting a policy discussion with respect to where this steering committee sees us going with respect to some of the current exemptions we have in our bylaws. Do we want to continue some of those? So that'll be part of the discussion as part of the policy discussion when we get to that stage. And then next steps in terms of scheduling the public meeting, when we have to have the background study completed, the draft bylaws, and then bringing those forward to council for approval prior to the current ones expiring. So I'll turn it over to Stefan and Rachel, and they'll walk us through the presentation that was included in the package.
Well, thank you very much, Randy, and thank you to the committee and Chairman Soever. This is a follow-up discussion from our last meeting on July the 19th, where we spent a lot of time going through the draft growth-related capital program that forms the basis of the development charge calculations. And that capital program has gone through one or two changes since then. It's been refined and finalized. And so we now have, as Randy mentioned, draft development charge rates for you, which we'll take you through, and then finish up with sort of the logistics on how we get from here to a bylaw passage. And a reminder too that your current bylaw expires at the end of this year. So in order to continue to collect development charges on the 1st of January, you must pass a bylaw before the end of this year. This will be, by the way, a much shorter presentation than what we did on July the 19th. So I'm just going to share my screen here. Randy, can you see that?
Yes.
Great.
That's great.
Okay. There we go. So we'll start with some of the changes that have occurred to the growth-related works in the capital program, and we'll start with long-term care. I understand that there's been a lot of debate about council's long-term plans to improve long-term care, and so we've followed those very closely, and we've had to make adjustments to reflect the recent council resolutions because we want to make sure that we're properly reflecting council's intentions in the background study. That is in fact a requirement of the DC Act. So just talk a little bit about what we've done here, and happy of course to have a discussion with this committee about the most appropriate way to deal with this. Our understanding is that council intends to proceed with the replacement and expansion of the Rockwood Terrace facility, and that will be a gross cost of just under $57 million, for which the county is receiving just under $30 million in grant funding. A considerable portion of that expenditure, overall expenditure, will be to replace the existing facility. And so to the extent that there is a replacement component or any component that benefits existing residents, that is ineligible for development charge funding. And so of the total $56.7 million, we're only bringing $3.1 million into the development charge calculation as a true growth-related element. And if you look at the bottom here, you can see we're bringing in $3.14 million into the rate. The county is eligible to bring in $5.5 million into the rate. But we are only bringing $3 million into the rate. And the reason for that is that we also understand that council has put a pause on the Grey Gables reconstruction project. And so we don't therefore know for sure when that will be constructed, if at all, during the next 10 years. And our recommendation now is to leave the Grey Gables project out of the DC study as a result, recognizing again that the Development Charges Act require us to reflect council's intentions in the background study. There are provisions under the Act that would allow council to amend the development charges bylaw during its term before it expires in 5 years' time, if things change vis-a-vis this project. So for example, if you made a decision in the next 12 months to proceed with Grey Gables, the background study that's released this fall has a lifespan of 12 months. And so you could do a very quick, easy amendment to the bylaw. You'd need to do a public meeting, but you wouldn't need to do any further analysis in the background study. And you can also amend the bylaw in years 2 to 5. That would, however, trigger an additional background study, but we could scope it very narrowly to deal only with the amendment portion, the Grey Gables component. So it's a fairly straightforward exercise. It does again require a public meeting, but there are mechanisms under the Act to amend your bylaw if things change. So maybe just I just perhaps Mr. Chairman, just pause there and just see if there's any questions about this matter.
No, I don't see any hands up. I have a question. The gross cost, that's based on the 400,000 per bed number?
Yes, that's correct, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, and then so in the pausing of Grey Gables, I think you explained that. So if it's paused, then, and I think that's the way it was discussed at council. So if the intention is to go ahead at some point in the future, then if it's within 12 months, then we don't need to go there. So what effect would that have? Would we be maxing out our DC funding envelope?
So, Mr. Chairman, no, you wouldn't be collecting any development charges for this project until there was a clearer resolution from council to actually proceed with it at a specific timing within the next 10 years.
So if there was, how many millions would that add to? Like, would that, what would that do to our total DC eligible costs? And on that, if there, I understand there's still a report coming on a campus of care approach. Like how far can you stretch long-term care? Like if long-term care contains some attainable seniors housing or assisted living, like does assisted living qualify, and what about attainable seniors housing, or in fact housing to support long-term care? Like one of the issues that we're going to have, and we're already having in this part of the county, is that the staff for long-term care can't afford to live here. So it's great if you build long-term care beds, but if you can't staff them, then, you know, it's kind of useless, right? So is there any flexibility in terms of, you know, support? Like, well, assisted living is one thing, but then if you go beyond that to, you know, housing in support of long-term care, is that eligible?
Yeah, so Mr. Chairman, just as far as the first question goes, the Act's quite permissive about what you can include in terms of costs, as long as they are growth related, as I say. And even if it doesn't fall under the, you know, the true umbrella of long-term care, you can also fund it through, you know, social housing provisions and other services. Perhaps we'd have to look at it a little more closely and see what the scope of the project is. But I think certainly everything you've mentioned now would almost certainly, in my mind, be eligible for DC funding. As for the maximum we can fund, that's at the bottom of the screen there. So under this bylaw, you can fund up to the $5.5 million. So we'd be able to roll in an additional, you know, $2.4 million into the rate.
And the ratios would be the same as for Rockwood Terrace?
Not necessarily, no.
No?
No, because we do those based on the scope of the project and you know, the extent to which additional beds are being added versus replacement.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I do see Randy Schertzer with his hand up.
Yeah, just further to Stefan's comments with respect to housing. So there were some housing projects included as part of the DC capital program. And one is in Dundalk and one is in Durham. And the Durham beds are anticipated to be part of what could be this campus of care. And so there's 30 units being proposed in Durham and 30 in Dundalk as per the housing's current capital plan. So those have been reflected as part of the overall DCs. So I just wanted to highlight that as something that's, you know, there's elements of the housing capital program that are part of what could be that campus of care model that we're exploring in Durham.
Okay, thank you. Anyone
Okay.
else? I don't see any other hands up, so I guess we can move along.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Moving then to some other changes for the roads and related category. So you'll remember we have different categories of roads projects in the DC capital program, and there's been some changes to the category 3s, category 4s, and category 6s. Category 3, you might remember, captures projects that result in the widening of a roadway in order to improve safety, sight lines, and shoulders in response to additional traffic. And a wider road platform actually also provides opportunities for active transportation, bike lanes, for example, near the urban centers, the growing urban centers. There's quite a high benefit to existing component for these works. It's anywhere between 30 and 60%. But there are significant costs involved all across the county. What we showed you in July was a fairly detailed program for the first 10 years of the 20-year time horizon covered by the roads. And then there was a general provision for that second 10 years. And I think we felt that it probably would be more a robust approach if we actually sat down and had a crack at figuring out what the specific projects would be in those second 10 years. And so that's been done by your transportation staff. And I think what we quickly realized was that general provision was probably a little high. So there's been an overall downward adjustment of the gross costs of these projects from $86 million to just over $66 million. Category 4 projects are specific investments in intersections across the county to improve traffic flow. They include new roundabouts and new turning lanes. We've added a new roundabout project to the program, which has increased it from around 22.5 million to 24.5 million. And we've also adjusted the benefit of existing components for the new turning lanes. There's a feeling that there really shouldn't be any benefit to existing component for those at all, because they are being constructed entirely to direct flow, traffic flow from new subdivisions into the county arterial road system. So those will have a 0% benefit to existing share. And then finally, the cost of the master plans and studies category has been adjusted slightly to reflect updated cost information. So that's come down very, very slightly. The bottom line is that the total costs being brought forward into the DC calculation are now just in excess of $89 million. That's well short of the funding cap of 162 million. And there's about $3 million related to some very large road infrastructure works towards the back end of the 20 years, where we think it's justified to allocate a portion of the benefit beyond the 20 years. So that's ineligible for DC funding now, but can be brought into a later bylaw at a later date.
I have a question. So on the second 10-year capital plan, where we reduce the general provision, we added projects, but those projects have not yet been considered by council. So then from a governance point of view, can we include projects that council has not yet opined on? And then as part of that, council has not approved. How do we deal with things that council has not approved that were part of the 2016 master transportation plan, like road transfers, which really based on the recommendations in that plan should have happened, but were never passed by council because there was an agreement on those. So we don't have really any current master transportation plan that includes road transfers. So, you know, some roads that might have become county roads, or county roads that might have become municipal roads as a result of the recommendations received way back 5 years ago now. You know, council has not made a final decision on those. So how do we deal with that in coming up with this not reduced number when we don't have a up-to-date master transportation plan?
Yes, Mrs. Chairman, it's a very good question. It comes up a lot. And I think really what it boils down to is that the requirement in the legislation that the background study be a reflection of council's intentions is a little softer than a requirement that council approve or have prior approval for every project that's in that study. So there's a couple of things here. First of all, there's an implicit acknowledgement by the legislation that you don't necessarily have all your master plans lined up in a row nicely at the timing you do a background study and update a bylaw. So these things are fluid, and that often council's intentions aren't reflected in an approved master plan. And when you look at the language in the regulation, you can see that, you know, it is quite soft about, you know, what constitutes, you know, the backup material for these approvals. Second thing I would mention is that the charges are imposed on a service. They're not charged on projects. And so the reflection of council's intentions must reflect to the services overall. They don't reflect to individual projects. And so there, again, there's an implicit acknowledgement there that over the life of the bylaw, for example, the costs of projects change, projects get substituted for other projects, growth doesn't pan out the way we think, and council's priorities change, all of that is permissible and doesn't get in the way of you being able to impose the charges.
Yeah, thank you. So so I'm just trying to relate that to the comments on long-term care, where council's intentions have bounced back and forth several times, and it appears their council is kind of split on whether the county should be involved in long-term care or shouldn't be. And so it's the same with roads, really. I think is what is the role of the county transportation network in the scheme of a larger integrated master transportation plan? So yeah, I'm just trying to wrap my head around that. So Randy's got his hand up.
Yeah, and thanks for the questions, Chair Soever. With respect to the capital, so obviously, like staff, we've got now a 10-year capital plan. We've got some other documents that we've relied on to try to outline a DC capital program. And it's a bit easier within the 0 to 10 years because now we do have a 10-year capital plan. Anything beyond 10 years becomes a little bit less detailed, I guess, in terms of what we think could happen. But I think transportation services have, rather than identifying as just a funding envelope, which is what was previously identified in the draft DC capital program, they've tried to look at, okay, based on the current conditions of roads and based on currently repaving some roads, and based on the policy that council has set, that we add in paved shoulders and do some road widenings with respect to roads when we're redoing those roads. They've looked at what they anticipate doing from 10 to 20 years, and that could change. We know there's changes that happens even from 0 to 10 years based on what we're seeing happening from either from a growth and development perspective, which is specifically in the case of development charges, or some other things that changes based on the road condition that we just weren't aware of at the stage when we set out a 10-year capital plan, or in this case, a 20-year program. So we know things will likely change. Things have changed even in previous development charges projects and background studies. And that's why we update these every 5 years to make sure that they're as current as possible. At least for the first 5 years, we have a good solid indication that those projects will for sure proceed. The next 5 years, I think we have a better understanding even from the previous DC background studies, because we now have a 10-year capital plan. And as we update those transportation master plan documents and move forward with those projects you've highlighted, we'll know more information even in the next background study update. And I think and as Stefan indicated, if things change like the long-term care or even in road projects, council does have the ability to make changes even to our background study and bylaws as we go, even within the first 5 years. So I think there's mechanisms to be able to hopefully adapt as we go. But based on the current information that we have before us today, this is the staff's best guess in terms of what we think is going to happen over the next 20 years from a roads related project perspective.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I think my concern is that it would be much easier, so we wouldn't have to be kind of flying by the seat of our plant and planning to make changes, is if staff knew what council's direction was with regard to how do we deal with the urbanization of some of our county roads. I mean, we've heard at council several times is, well, sidewalks, county roads aren't for pedestrians, but the fact is that as the county becomes more urbanized, there will be pedestrians. And so just knowing what the philosophy of council is with regard to that and future improvements that could be made, I would say that looking at the amount of cap space we have here, that perhaps we could be, collecting money for costs that are going to be coming at us in the future. And as we become, just understanding the philosophy and how we're going to deal with roads in the future. Anyone else? I don't want to be the only one asking questions. Okay, well, just move on then.
Mr. Chair, if I might,
Oh, yes, go ahead.
I didn't put my virtual hand up, had my physical hand up. I apologize, Stefan, if this question has already been answered. I'm sure that it was at the last meeting. We are required to do an update every 5 years. But are we looking at a 10-year or 20-year or 5-year? And what has been Grey County's pattern with respect to projecting out?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Councillor. Yeah, I probably should have reiterated that at the beginning of this presentation. So the bylaw has a term of 5 years. We calculate the rates for all of the so-called general services on the basis of a 10-year planning horizon. And then for the roads, we look at 20 years.
And has that been our tradition? Have we always done it that way?
Yes.
Thank you.
That's not at all unusual in other county jurisdictions either.
So just following up on that, so if we don't maximize what we collect in this 5 years, and when we make an amendment, then that's money that we don't have and we can't recoup then.
Well, Mr. Chairman, you can't recoup it from development that has occurred between now and when the amendment is passed.
Yes.
But after the amendment is passed, obviously you will be charging it on all development from then until, in theory, the end of the 20-year period.
Yeah, no, but we will never get back that amount. We can't go retroactive, obviously.
That's correct.
Okay, please continue. I don't see any other hands up.
Okay, this is just a summary of the costs associated with the program for the general services. I don't propose to go through every service here, but so we'll just work through the bottom line here as a reminder of how we allocate the costs. So the gross costs of for each service are at the bottom. It's just about $80 million in total. 56.7 associated with Rockwood Terrace, you'll remember. The second column identifies any grants or subsidies that are available to fund the works. And again, it's just the $29 million for the Rockwood Terrace project that we are aware of. Then we have the benefit to existing component that's been removed from the costs, which is an additional $26.1 million. The prior growth column represents funds that the county has on hand in its development charge reserves to pay for some of these costs. And then the 2022 to 2031 column represents those costs that can be attributed to growth within the 10 years. The 8.7 million, and that's the number that will be carried forward into the rate calculation. And then for a certain component of the costs, those will benefit growth beyond the 10 years, and that's about $15.4 million. They're still development charge eligible, but you will only be able to recover those costs from future bylaws. Bylaws in years 5 to 10 or bylaws after that. And that for land ambulance relates to some of the debt that is being recovered over a long period of time, and for social housing where a considerable number of the units will have benefits that extend well into the future. And then it's the same chart here for the roads. So working along the bottom row, then it's $157 million worth of roads costs, $11 million of grants, $56 million benefiting existing residents in the county. Quite a considerable amount of reserve funds on hand to fund the roads, almost $18 million of road reserve funds. And then $68 million that's being brought into the rate. and just under $3 million of post-period benefit for those projects that are sort of identified in 2039, 2040.
But going back to the social housing number of 16.8, does that include anything for potential? I think Randy mentioned that there might have been something in there for a potential campus of care at Grey Gables. Does that 16.8 include anything for that?
There are 2 projects identified here, each of which creates 30 units. One of them is in Durham, and I believe the other's in Dundalk, Randy?
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
Yep, 30 units in Dundalk, 30 in Durham, both estimated 8.4 million in construction. And so those are full DC eligible.
Okay, thank you.
So these are the maximum rates that you could impose under the Development Charges Act. So on the left here, you can see it's $8,400 per single and semi-detached unit, and then there are lower rates for the units that have lower occupancies, $5,800 per townhouse, row house unit, and then $4,800 for an apartment. The vast majority of the charge, the residential charge, is related to the roads as it is currently, but there are now significant components of the charge for social housing and long-term care, which don't currently, which aren't currently included in the current charge. And on the non-residential side, we've calculated a maximum rate you could impose of $105 per square meter of new gross floor area for a commercial or residential building, almost entirely related to the roads. So you'll see here that there are a number of services for the residential sector for which we've not calculated a charge for the non-residential sector. Because we sort of really consider that the need for things like long-term care and social housing is really driven by the population growth in the residential sector. So it's only the studies, the land ambulance, and the roads that apply here. This table just compares for each of the services, and then for the overall charge at the bottom, how the current charge compares with what we've calculated. So you have the first column of figures gives you the current charge that's in force. It's $7,500 per unit charge, and the calculated charge is $8,400 a unit. This is a single detached unit, an increase of $881 per unit. You can see that within the services, there's quite a lot of variation. So obviously the ones that stick out are the social housing, where we don't currently have a charge, and long-term care, where we don't currently have a charge. But there are some increases in land ambulance, trails, public works, where we do for some public works. And there's also been a fall in the roads charge, and particularly the development related studies charge. And you'll remember that these 2 services in particular have quite considerable reserve funds in hand, and that is having a dragging down effect on our ability to collect funds for those particular services.
Just a question, singles and semis are treated as one. And, you know, we've had this discussion here at the town level as well, and then you have your large rural estates, you know, $5 or $6 million properties that occupy 100 acres or something like that. You know, a very large piece of land up on the escarpment. Obviously, in terms of linear assets like roads and even sewer and water. Now, the rural area isn't really serviced, and I know the county doesn't do sewer and water, but roads. The fewer properties you have, or the larger the lot size, the the more you're going to spend on roads to service very few residents potentially as the lot size goes up. So I'm just wondering why we don't have we are charging the same, whether it's a single or a semi, irrespective of lot size. That's my understanding.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, that's the current category. There aren't many single detached homes in the county. So we could certainly explore having a separate charge for semis, but there might not, I'm just thinking out loud here, it might be a bit tricky finding suitable data to justify what the semis charge might be. The other thing we have to be a little bit careful about is that you know, the charges are generally based on the number of occupants of any particular dwelling type. So they're not based on the size of the unit or the value, the assessed value of a unit. We can't actually impose a development charge. It's not a tax on wealth. It's a tax on benefits. So
Yeah,
we do have to be a little bit careful about that.
Yeah, and I recognize that, but certainly what we've seen here is that, you know, you have a 6-bedroom house and, you know, 2 people are living there retired, and now there's the one of the children and, you know, their spouse and 2 little kids. So now there's 6 people living in that house using services. And, you know, obviously you couldn't do that in a 2-bedroom semi on a 20-foot lot. Well, if we allowed those 20-foot lots, but anyway, that's another story. But if you go to a small semi, say 2 bedrooms versus a 4 or 5-bedroom house with, and even though people don't live there, a lot of the people that live there have friends come out for the weekend, and those put a stress on services and roads and everything else as well. So, you know, I think there is something to be said about the size of a property. You know, potentially there's no law against that you have to keep to your 2.3 person average household. And obviously when your property's small, you can't really go too far beyond that. But when your property is immense, you know, you can have 4 or 5 couples up every weekend for a party. And, you know, and I see that happening in our neighborhood. So, you know, I'm just wondering what the logic, and perhaps there's room to, are there municipalities that, you know, separate by the number of bedrooms, or
There's certainly, Mr. Chairman, municipalities that have a separate charge for semi-detached units, and we'd be happy to explore that for the county. That's a relatively straightforward exercise. We can certainly bring that forward.
Thank you. Are there any other questions at this point? Okay, please continue.
Just a breakdown now of the non-residential rate by service. We saw this in the pie chart a couple of slides earlier. It's basically a roads charge, 99% of the total charge. This chart compares the residential rate per single detached unit with some of the other county jurisdiction rates that are in force right now. And in Simcoe County's case, what's being considered, because that's just been calculated and brought forward. And you can see that the current charge in gray, the $7,500 per unit charge, is sort of around about the middle of the range right now. And an $8,400 charge would still keep you within the middle of the range. In fact, it's lower than what's showing as what's for the county of Peterborough. It's almost exactly the same charge there. The higher end charges are in, as you might expect, the more rapidly growing places like Simcoe County, and indeed in Simcoe they're looking at a 45% increase in the charge right now, and considering that, and that increase is overwhelmingly related to roads needs. They, by the way, are undertaking a transportation master plan concurrently. So I don't know how much of those additional costs are coming out of that plan directly. It may even be that they have to amend their bylaw again in the next few years to reflect what's coming out of the master plan. And then some of the lower charges are in perhaps some of the more rural areas like Dufferin County and Wellington County. And on the non-residential side, you can see we've just compared this to this would be the commercial rate that's in place in these jurisdictions. So the Grey County rate obviously is quite high in this context. It's the highest by far of all the rates that are in place. But of course, the county doesn't actually impose a rate on any non-residential development. And so, and there are many of these municipalities that will discount or otherwise exempt outright certain forms of non-residential development from the charge, including most commonly industrial development. But otherwise, for the commercial side, all of these places have a rate in place, even albeit a relatively low one.
So on this, I couldn't help but notice that the Grey County rate is 3 times the Simcoe County rate, whereas on the and a little over twice the newly Simcoe County rate. So, and since this is mostly a roads charge, and the increase on their residential is also largely due to the roads, but it's only gone up far less. 50% versus, so the ratios are different. Is this a function of a relatively small projections on the employment growth, or why is ours so much bigger than Simcoe's here, where the residential rate is far closer?
Mr. Chairman, I might need to get back to you on that because I'm not involved in the Simcoe County study, so I can't be sure why there's a difference in the rate of increase. But invariably, as you say, a large part of it probably has to do with shifts in the growth forecasts. But I can't be certain for Simcoe.
Okay, Ollie, I'd be interested in that because I couldn't help but notice the ratios were different between the residential and the non-res, but I presume that's a function of the growth projections for employment, because the non-residential obviously is based on employment growth. Yes, Ms. Wingrove?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And just, Stefan, if you can just help and remind me, the amount of discretion that a council has about between a calculated charge and what they determine they actually want to charge. Do you have that ability?
Yes, I mean, and to be clear to everyone on this committee, these are everything you see for Grey County in red is what you could impose in theory under the act, but of course you're free to charge whatever you want as long as it doesn't exceed that amount. And as I say, many of the charges on this particular slide we know have been discounted already. But for the Simcoe County one, I think Mr. Chairman's question was about the newly calculated rate, which should be the maximum calculated rate. So.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, moving on then. Just wanted to highlight some of the provisions in your bylaw because these are obviously fall within your your discretion as we move forward. We will be bringing a draft bylaw forward in advance of the public meeting. And I'm aware, of course, that you went through an exercise last year where you looked at the exemptions in the bylaw for certain forms of housing. And I don't propose to sort of go through those all again, although I do have a slide on this, the next slide. And I know Randy here was intimately involved in preparing those, so he will be answering any questions about the minutiae of how they work. But we thought we'd just start on, conversation about some of these areas of discretion, should you wish to pursue different policies moving forward. So as you probably know, there are exemptions that the legislation requires you to impose through the bylaw. So boards of education and development by municipalities are exempt from payment of DCs. There's also a statutory exemption for the expansion of existing industrial buildings up to 50% of the original size of the building. And there's a relatively new exemption. Well, there was an existing exemption for secondary units, but its scope has been expanded under the recently passed legislation, so that pretty well all secondary units, whether they're within attached or detached dwellings, and whether they're associated with new construction or existing development, are exempt from payment of development charges. And then over and above the statutory exemptions, the Grey County bylaw also exempts public hospitals, institutional church uses, agricultural uses that are off the municipal services, farm buildings, and then accommodations for seasonal or temporary agricultural laborers. And all of those are fairly standard and fairly widespread in Ontario, particularly in more rural agricultural areas. And then finally, there's also a blanket exemption for all commercial and industrial uses. As I say, there are discounts or exemptions are quite common for non-residential uses. Less common is a broad-based exemption like the one you have in place. Most county jurisdictions will have at least a nominal charge on commercial development. And as I say, the industrial typically attracts more of the discounts, and principally as a way of incenting that kind of development to an area. We've just put a number here in the bottom right-hand corner. So under the current forecasts, the cost of that exemption over the 5-year term of the bylaw, it's about $13 million, so $2.7 million a year. Excuse me. That would, of course, include the industrial expansions as well, which you have no control over, but a significant portion of that would be obviously the non-statutory exemption that you impose.
So the 13.3, is that just our discretionary, or that includes the statutory?
That includes all non-residential development. So the industrial expansions, as well as all of the new builds for commercial, institutional, and industrial.
Okay, thank you.
And then, as I say, there were a suite of other exemptions that were introduced in 2020 for purpose-built rental housing, nonprofit housing, the additional dwelling units, the secondary units. That essentially mirrors the statutory exemption on those types of units. There was changes made to the redevelopment credits, where a non-residential space is being converted to a residential use. And then there were some limited exemptions put into place for projects that have been approved through your community improvement plan as well. As I say, I won't go into the mechanics of these, but they are there.
So once they're exemptions, then the county does not have to offset them by putting money in. Is that correct?
No, Mr. Chairman, if they are discretionary exemptions, then the county must use its own funds to cover the exempted revenue.
Okay, so what is the cost of these other exemptions then that you project for the 5 years?
For the ones on the screen here,
Yes.
off the top of my head, I don't have those. I know that those were presented to you in the staff report that accompanied this particular exercise, and I'm sure we can pull those fairly easily and present them to you.
Okay, thank you. That'd be great.
Okay. Some other provisions in the bylaw. There's an indexing provision that ensures that the bylaws are indexed annually on January the 1st. So again, this is a relatively common provision, allows the rates to keep pace with rising non-residential construction prices. And there are also provisions in the bylaw to provide credits for people who redevelop a site that has been demolished or destroyed by fire, for example, provided that redevelopment occurs within a 5-year window. There are also provisions in the bylaw, and most of this will be in a section of the background study that sets out those services for which developers of subdivisions will be directly responsible for paying for when they subdivide land. Those so-called local services are not funded through development charges, and so we tend to have guidelines to ensure that developers are aware what they're responsible for through their subdivision agreements and what they will be paying for when they pay their development charge. And then finally, there's a provision under the legislation that allows the county to strike agreements with developers to alter the timing of payment. And there are enacting provisions under the bylaw to allow the county to enter into those agreements.
What are the DCs indexed to? Because obviously for roads, there's the construction price index. For many of the services that the county provides, it's not really tied to the CPI. It's tied to more wages and you know, so I know some larger municipalities have their own inflation index that reflects the increase in cost that the basket of goods that the municipality provides, rather than, you know, because that can be quite different than the CPI. So what are we proposing to index our DCs to?
Well, Mr. Chairman, you don't really have a choice because it's prescribed. It's the non-residential construction price index.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, continue, please.
Sure. Some important changes were made in 2019 that took effect as of the 1st of January 2020. And these changes will no doubt affect area municipalities in gray as they are the DC collectors for themselves and for the county. Previously, the issuance of a building permit was the default timing of payment of a charge. And now we have two changes that we have to grapple with. One changes the amount of the development charges that are payable, and the other changes the timing of payment. So on the left here, we have the so-called DC freeze that's been put into place. What this does is it freezes the amount that is payable to the date a developer applies for a site plan or a rezoning. So that's the date at which it's calculated, and then they come along and pay when they draw their building permits. Whereas previously they paid on whatever the rate was in place when they drew their building permit. Now it's backdated to the point at which they applied for their site plan or rezoning. And the second change applies to very specific types of development: rental housing, institutional development, and nonprofit housing. And for these, payment is made in annual installments. 5-year annual installments for rentals and institutional development, and 20-year installments, annual installments for nonprofit housing. The first installment being paid at the time of occupancy, and then every year subsequent to that. So that of course will involve some administrative burden on some of the area municipalities. It doesn't affect the Treasury Department of the county, because while they receive the revenue, it gets remitted monthly to them by the area municipalities. They don't actually have to collect the charge. But wanted to make you aware of the changes nonetheless. So just in terms of moving forward from here, and some of the decisions that'll be brought forward to you before, obviously, the final decision to pass the bylaw. We have some resolutions for you today to consider and approve the development-related capital program, and direct us to proceed with drafting a background study on the basis of that program. Our hope is that we can hold a public meeting on October the 28th. And as I say, a draft version of the bylaw will be released in advance of that 2 weeks in advance of that meeting. And you will have to make a decision as to whether whether another public meeting is required after that. And then when it comes, of course, to the rates themselves, there's a whole, as Ms. Wingrove laid out, there's really all sorts of options available to you. You can adopt the full rates, you can discount the rates, you can discount them for a certain type of development. You can delay their implementation if you like and keep the current rates in place. You can also phase them in, which is, I believe, what we did back in 2006 when this was first introduced. And of course, there are the exemptions that can be changed should you wish to change any of the current structure.
So on the implementation options, the full or partial rates, if you go on a partial rate and you set a rate that's lower, then does the county still have to make up the difference? I'm guessing not. But if you do put in an exemption, then there is an obligation. Is that correct?
No, Mr. Chairman, you can't. If you're going to put in a partial rate, you can't recover that lost revenue through a higher charge on another developer or type of development.
No.
So again, the county has to fund the lost revenue.
So if there's a recommendation for a full, but if the county implements a partial rate through a lesser amount, there's still an obligation to recover the difference?
That's right. Invariably, it'll be the property taxpayer that is funding the difference.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
I see a question, Mr. Chairman, from Mr. Schertzer.
Yeah,
Randy?
through you, Mr. Chair, is exactly what Stefan just indicated at the end there. It was in terms of recovery or making up the difference. I just wanted to clarify that essentially what it means is if we're not collecting it through DCs, we have to collect through another source, and that source would likely be through a levy increase in order to fund the difference that we're not collecting through DCs through those discretionary exemptions. So I just wanted to clarified that piece, but Stefan indicated that towards the end there in terms of what that making up the difference entails.
Yeah. Okay, please continue.
Okay, and then finally, just to review our timeline here, is maybe let's work backwards from December. So council passage of the bylaws has to occur before the 1st of January. I understand that there is going to be no December the 23rd council meeting, and so I think we sort of penciled in the idea that your December 9th council meeting might be an appropriate date for council to consider passing the bylaw. And then, as I say, we've earmarked the date of the public meeting to be October the 28th. If the bylaws are going to be passed on December the 9th, the background study has to be released 60 days in advance of that decision, which effectively means October the 9th, which is why one of the reasons why you have the resolution in front of you today to direct us to begin drafting the background study. So that we can do that and make sure that it is ready for an October the 9th release.
Okay. Are there any questions on that? Okay, so thank you very much. If there's no questions, then I guess we should move to the motions that we need to approve. So Madam Clerk, have you prepared motions for us?
I have prepared one, Mr. Chair, and I will read it out to the committee. That the presentation of Hemson Consulting Limited regarding the development charges background study and bylaw update 2021 be received, and that staff instruct Hemson Consulting Limited to prepare the draft development charges bylaws on the basis of the updates to the growth-related capital programs, and that staff hold a public meeting on October 28th, 2021 to receive comments on the development charges background study and draft development charges bylaw.
Thank you. I see Council Warden Hicks has his hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry, I did have a question sort of last minute. The comment made by Randy with respect to, well, first of all, there's a comment made that DC charges are not based on wealth, but rather on benefit. And so if we have exemptions and we have a shortfall, Randy says, then we may be looking at imposing a levy to make up the shortfall, which essentially is it not a transfer from benefit back to wealth?
Well, I can have a stab at that, Mr. Chairman. Others may want to weigh in. I think in theory, you're absolutely correct. Development charges are a tool provided to municipalities by the province to allow them to recover growth-related capital costs from those who benefit from it. And if you don't avail fully of the tool or don't use it at all, then you are using taxes, which is fundamentally a redistributive mechanism to fund those costs.
So if we're looking at, when we're looking at benefit, essentially benefit equals, I guess, people, users, correct? And in determining that, we generally look at households. But I know there's some case law that suggests that looking at a household is not the accurate way. I raised this in light of some of the comments raised by Councillor Chairman, I should say, which is you could have trends where you show that your per household population is going down. So in other words, if you have a large seniors population, you might assume that many of those households with seniors have fewer persons per household than the average, say, across the province. But in instances where you've got new and growing communities, new builds, presumably majority housed by families, you might have a higher average there. So how do you do the population growth or projection by use? And I think Councillor Sullivan raises a legitimate point. If you aren't looking at the uses, meaning, you could have population determined by people who are permanent residents. But if we know for a fact that the numbers, the users, are actually higher than what the population shows, what allows for us to look at those specific features? I know there was a long prelude and convoluted, but I'm trying to grapple with this whole benefit equaling population.
Yeah, I through you, Mr. Chairman. It's an excellent point, and we spend a lot of time doing this when we do the background study. So as you say, the benefits are, we generally think of the benefits as to people, but the charge is imposed on a building, or a built form. And so we have to make assumptions about, how many people are associated with any one kind of unit type. We don't tend to look at averages. When we come up with the persons per unit for establishing the charge, we look very closely at the units that have been recently constructed. And so we look at only the units that have been constructed over the last 10 years generally as a way of establishing those persons per units for the next 10 years, for example. And they're very different from the averages. So we do look very closely at that. And we do account for the seasonal occupancy of certain kinds of units as well.
Yes, and following up on that, certainly last March, we saw an instantaneous change from seasonal units to permanent units. And now with the ability to work from home, some of that is not going. So previously in the Blue Mountains, I think the assumption was that 50% of the units would be for seasonal use based on census data from 2016 and prior, where, traditionally that's been the mix of housing here is about 50% seasonal. But instantaneously in March 2020, we saw those occupied permanently, and some people are never going to leave because they've decided that now that they can work from home part of the time, that they'd rather be here 5 days a week and then in Toronto 2 days a week. So it's almost like the Toronto property is now seasonal use. So how are we dealing with all that?
Well, Mr. Chairman, obviously, we still don't know for sure until we get the results of the 2021 census exactly what the permanent population is in the county. So I think some of these changes that you're describing will become apparent as those census releases are take place over the coming years. And I would expect that all of those changes that are taking place will be available the next time we do the background study. But for the moment, we use the best data available. Some of that, I'm afraid, is still 2016 census information, but we have supplemented that, of course, with building permit data, housing completions data, labor force data, anything we can get our hands on.
Thank you.
And Mr. Chairman, further complicating things are uses like B&B. And I don't know how we keep stats on that, but if the use is by a senior versus a use by a B&B rental situation, then obviously the benefit calculation is much higher for the B&B. So these are complicated things to try to wrestle with, aren't they?
Yes, for sure, because we have a short-term accommodation bylaw, and then where now bed and breakfasts are theirs, but really the short-term accommodations are really commercial uses in a residential setting. So yeah, we open up that can of worms, because I think everybody has that issue here. I don't know whether municipalities are looking at a short-term accommodation bylaw. So we know where the legal ones are, but the Airbnbs, I mean, that just brings so many more people into the area, because an Airbnb, if it's 3 bedrooms, you can be sure, well, not every weekend, but there'll be often be 6 people there every weekend. It's because that's the way that economy works. So yeah, it's not easy, especially with all these, tourism-based municipalities. Okay, so we have the resolution. So we need a mover and seconder for that. Everybody remembers what we're voting for still? Shirley, you're moving. Sue, you're seconding. Okay, so it's been moved by Shirley and seconded by Sue. We'll call the question. Any opposed? Seeing none, it's carried. Okay, anything else that you need, Randy? A resolution on?
Not at this stage. Obviously, we can follow up on some of the matters that have been raised by the DC Steering Committee today. Steph indicated that we'll be drafting out the bylaws and bringing those back for further discussion. And then following the public meeting, we'll of course then have another meeting just to go over some of the comments that were heard from the members of the public, and then forward with any proposed revisions to council, and then hopefully hitting that December 9th council date as Stefan described. So that's kind of the next steps in terms of how we move forward. And obviously, if there's any questions in between now and then, just feel free to reach out to myself and we'll get those answers for you.
Warden Hicks, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We had no discussion of whether to hold another public meeting. I just wonder, what is the recommendation of staff? What we have planned, is that sufficient? Are you recommending something further?
Yeah, I think through you, Mr. Chair, we're thinking that because it's going to be a virtual public meeting that will be held on October 28th, that hopefully that'll provide opportunities for others to be able to connect and join in. Part of that, we'll obviously record that as well. So people that are not able to attend that meeting, they'll still be able to view the public meeting and any comments from that. And of course, posting up the minutes. In previous years, we felt that seems to be sufficient. Well, of course, once we have the DC background study, we'll send it out to obviously local municipalities and to a contact list of developers and other consultants as well, just to put it on their radar so that it's they don't have to go digging through our website to find it. So we'll do that as well. And of course, we're happy to have those one-on-one discussions if there's any questions from developers with respect to where we're going with or potentially where we're going with the development charge. Yeah, I think at this stage, we're thinking one's probably sufficient. If we find that after the October 28th and the DC Steering Committee indicates we want to have another public meeting, recognizing that we are dealing with a fairly tight time frame to get this bylaws approved before the end of the year, we can have that discussion depending on the outcome of the 28th.
On that, so I guess if there's substantive changes as a result of the input received on the 28th, then there's a notice period, and to have a second public meeting and then bring back a report with those comments. I don't see that there's actually enough time in the schedule.
Yeah, we probably in the special council meeting territory then to consider passing a bylaws prior to end of the year. If we ended up in that situation, which it's doable if we find that there are significant revisions following the public meeting. We're not anticipating any based on currently as we've seen the proposed draft DC rates are pretty much in alignment with what exists today, with some just even inflation or indexing associated with it really when you apply to some of the changes. So but we could hear some comments based on what is being proposed. So if at that stage we determine that there is going to be significant revisions following the 28th, then we'll have to figure out a bit of a game plan. But I think we're in special council meeting territory in that stage in order to make it work.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I don't see anybody else's hands up. So any other business? Don't see any. Next meeting date to be determined.
Yeah, we'll work with Hempson to figure out some potential dates of when we'll have the draft DC bylaws completed and can bring those forward. So we'll work with Hempson and clerks, of course, and make sure it works for everyone's calendars. But we haven't set a solid date at this point in time right now.
Okay, thank you. And then I take a motion to adjourn. Mover and seconder, moved by Warden Hicks, seconded by Sue. Madam Clerk, please call the question. Any opposed? Hearing none. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you for chairing the meeting.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hey, everyone, have a good day.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.